Hello again. Thank you for cooperating, most of you, making your way to your seats as requested. If you've not yet done that, now is the time. We're going to be closing the bar out here. The bar in the back is going to stay open for the duration of the event. So don't be disruptive, but feel free to refill. Thanks for coming. The first thing I'd like to do is welcome the members of the Nevada Independent who support us on a monthly, quarterly, or annual basis. They've got VIP seating tonight, and I'd like to ask all the members of the Nevada Independent to stand up if they would so that our team can salute you. Go ahead. Up you go. Yay. Most of them didn't do it. Well, we're a libertarian state. It's fine. Welcome to the very first Indy Forum, State of Pot. We're thrilled to have all of you here. Thanks for participating. Thanks for showing up. How many people here read? The editor's so going to disapprove of this question. How many of you read us every single day? Okay, good. I just wanted my reporters who are way in the back to see that. Round of applause for them, please. I'm Elizabeth Thompson, by the way, the managing editor of the Nevada Independent. Thrilled to be here, thrilled to be working with Jon Ralston, our founder and editor, who's going to be coming up here momentarily to get this event started. Our Indy Talks and Indy Forums events are designed to elevate the conversation in Nevada, not so much about the politics, but about the policy. And we thought it was appropriate for our very first Indy Forums to make marijuana the topic because local policy, state policy, federal policy, it all comes to bear. Lots of moving parts. Many of you in this room are going to learn a lot tonight. Some of you are only going to learn a bit tonight. But in any case, we hope you will all come away with something. We've got 3 great panels lined up. We're going to start with the editor and reporter Michelle Rindels, who has done a fair amount of reporting on this topic. And where's Riana? Riana needs to get mic'd up. And Riana, who is the executive director of the Nevada Dispensary Association. All the sponsors in the front row already know her, in the second row. Those of you who don't know her are about to learn that she's quite the policy pro. She keeps track of what's going on a local and a state level. She helped shepherd some of the recent legislation through. She was up there lobbying and explaining and drawing circles and arrows to make sure that all the lawmakers understood what they were approving. So thanks again for coming. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my business partner and my dear, dear friend, the publisher, editor, and founder of the Nevada Independent, Jon Ralston.
I'm good. Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me in the back? I know there's thousands of people. I can barely see everyone back there. I do want to thank all of you for coming. This is quite a treat for Elizabeth and me to have all you folks come to our inaugural Indy Forums. Now, I feel kind of badly for some of you in the audience, the ones who are not Indy members yet. What is wrong with you people? Think of how great it felt for all the people out there who are Indy members to have that applause. I just want to say just a word about the Independent. We're just over a year old now. We started on January 17th of last year. And I've done a lot of different things in journalism, which is my usual euphemism for I've been fired from a lot of jobs in journalism. And this is by far the most exhilarating and exhausting and rewarding part of my career, working with this fabulous, fabulous team that we have. They're Most of them are back there, and Michelle is going to come up in a moment. And Elizabeth, who I have to tell you is one of the best friends of my life, and not just a wonderful person, but she's the person who put this event together along with Natalie Keeney. Where's Natalie? Natalie, stand up. There's Natalie in the back. Natalie and Elizabeth put this together, and this event would not exist without them. That's the best part of the Indy, really, is that we are a team, and we all do work together, and we've created a culture of transparency and independence in journalism that I don't think has been seen here or elsewhere, and we're very, very proud of the work that we have done so far. And we're going to be unveiling a lot of new features at the Indy as this year goes on. And we really do hope that you will go and look at the site. If you don't read it every day, and I know some of you were lying, it's okay. But you should read it every day and go to that little tab that says support our work. We have members who give just as little as $5 a month. Every little bit helps. We're trying to be sustainable, and we want to keep doing these kinds of events. I want to thank all of our sponsors for tonight's event. Many of them are sitting up here. I'd name them all, but there's just way too many of them. You can see them right up on the board up there. Appreciate it. Let's give a round of applause for our sponsors tonight. And of course, I want to give a big thanks to our hosts here at UNLV. We love partnering with UNLV. We do our podcast here, some of you may listen to every week, called Indy Matters, which we do at KUNV on the campus. And we love our partnership with UNLV, and we hope it continues for many, many years to come. So let me get this event started. Some of you may have seen the agenda. We're going to have 3 different panels. The second one will be mostly about law enforcement issues and regulation, and the third one will be a more general industry panel. And I have to tell you, I could not be more thrilled with the quality of panelists that we have gathered here tonight to really talk about these issues in a way that they haven't been before. But before I bring those panelists up, I want to bring up a couple of folks to discuss. Just kind of give I don't assume everybody here is in the business or knows all of what's going on in the marijuana industry here. So we're going to kind of get to the initial state of pot discussion with Riana Durrett, who is the head of the Dispensary Association, and Michelle Rindels, who is our reporter who covers pot. So both of you come on up here. These chairs are unusually comfortable. If I nod off, that's why. All right, so Michelle, let's start with you. There was actually, thanks to Tick Segerblom. I don't know if any of you have heard of Tick Segerblom or not. We're in this room. Tick is here, I think, somewhere. Aren't you, Tick? Are you still here? He may have gotten lost. You know how pot affects the brain, but no, we'll get to that later on. But Tick actually made a big announcement today to try to hype this forum for us, and I'm going to have Riana talk about some of the issues that he brought up. But what did Tick Segerblom and Councilwoman Lois Tarkanian announce today, Michelle?
Yeah, so Tick Segerblom, am I on? Okay. Tick Segerblom announced today that he wanted to call for a special session to try to get the funds that are coming from the excise tax, the 10% tax on recreational marijuana, to go not to the rainy day fund as a legislature prescribed this past session, and it would instead go to the schools, particularly Clark County School District, but probably wherever the source of those funds were coming from. Lois Tarkanian, who had been an opponent of legalization, was also on board with getting these funds to Clark County School District and the other school districts. And of course, you know, we're hearing about the budget cuts that they're having to make in Clark County School District, some unexpected shortfalls they've had. So they're trying to build some momentum over this. We reached out to Governor Sandoval, who quickly said that he didn't think a special session was necessary. He would have needed to call the session, or the legislators had to get a 2/3 majority to call themselves into a special session. We reached out to Senator Ford and Speaker Frierson, who haven't returned our call yet about whether they're going to lobby for that yet. So that's where we're at.
I wonder why they don't want to talk about that subject, Michelle. So Riana, let's talk about, this is one of the most misunderstood things I think about marijuana, where the money is going. I'm sure you get this all the time. We get emails. I think public officials are asked about this. I thought all the money was going to education. There's not just one tax. There's more than one tax. Explain how it works.
Right. There's taxes at every level of government, federal, state, and local. In particular, this misconception that there's money that was supposed to go to education under Question 2, and the voters voted to have this money go to education, and now it's not, it's going to the rainy day fund. That's a misunderstanding. Under Question 2, there are certain funds that are allotted to education. All of those funds are of taxes coming in that are now going to the rainy day fund. And if you'd like, I could go over a list of the taxes.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go.
So at the federal level, these businesses are taxed just like any other business, but there is a special provision that applies to them because of the being scheduled as a Schedule 1 drug that does not allow them to take any standard deductions or credits. So this is really critical to understanding the marijuana industry and how it plays a role in our state and any economic impacts it has or can have, because their tax rate is so high compared to any other business because of their being a Schedule 1 drug. So they, like I said, they can't take deductions for payroll, marketing. Anybody who runs a business knows that's significant. That's how you make your money, by taking those deductions. So at the federal level, there's the 280E provision. At the state level, there's taxes at the wholesale level. 15% of the fair market value goes to education, that goes to pay the costs of the program and to pay the costs of some local costs, local government costs. There is, now at the retail level, there's an excise tax, the bonus 10%, and there is also sales tax on both medical and adult use. The only difference in the tax structures between medical and adult use is the 10% retail tax. The excise tax is not also on medical. And then under that, you have the local government level. They pay up to 3%, the marijuana establishments pay up to 3% gross revenue to their local governments, and that is on each facility. So even if you're vertically integrated, your dispensary, cultivation, and production can all pay up to 3% of the gross revenue.
That was good.
That's a lot.
You have to take a breath there, didn't you? So I'm going to talk in a second, Riana, about projections and where everything's coming in, because I know you have some news you want to impart here. Michelle, for those folks out here who are, unlike us, lucky enough not to have to be up at the legislature and watch the sausage being made, I think there's probably still some confusion about why is this money in the rainy day fund in the first place. Riana alluded to this, but essentially this occurred at the end of the session because of a dispute that had nothing to do with marijuana at all. The same amount of money, actually, Riana, you can correct me if I'm wrong, actually the governor made sure that he pledged in his State of the State speech $60 odd million meant to marijuana, but it went into, some of that money had to go into the rainy day fund. Why? Do you remember that nightmarish scenario, Michelle?
Yeah, so you had the Republican minority that wanted to pass the education savings accounts, the private school voucher-style program, get funding to that, but the leverage that they had was either to vote or to vote against the bill that created the 10% marijuana excise tax that would bring that $64 million over 2 years to the state. So basically they withheld their votes. Nevada has a provision where you have to have a 2/3 majority to approve a tax increase. So they had enough to stop that. There was a lot of wrangling back and forth, attempts to get this education savings account program funded, strike some sort of a deal. It never really got there. The excise tax 10% was voted down by the Republicans. And there's a provision that requires education funding to be approved first. So that moved forward without this pot tax money in it. So basically the bow was tied. They couldn't attach the pot tax money to the education as it was originally intended. So they decided to put it into the rainy day reserve fund. So right now we're building up a reserve fund using a lot of this pot tax money. Some people are not totally against that idea because we didn't know how well the industry was going to do, and you don't want to necessarily tie a very exact dollar amount to education. If it falls short, you could have some problems. But right now we're building up this reserve fund. I think there's about $157 million in that fund right now. Our 2-year budget is $8 billion, so you can kind of do the math at what that is. That's supposed to be, a buffer if the economy goes down. So that's kind of how we ended up with the money going to the rainy day fund instead of education.
And Riana and other pot lobbyists were pulling their hair out at the end of the session, wondering what was going to happen. Do you recall that part of it, Riana?
Yeah.
I bet
hopefully
you do.
I forget by next
Yes,
session.
exactly. So let's talk about that. Michelle brings up the point that we didn't really know how much money the industry was going to bring in, how much these taxes were going to bring in. Just as the legislature always makes these projections. What has happened vis-a-vis those projections since the session?
Well, we've seen through articles and throughout the Nevada Independent that projections have been met. The more funds are coming in than even projected. For example, the rainy day fund was projected to be $63 million per biennium. For 6 months of 2017, it actually brought in $19 million. So if that was just over a biennium, that would be times 4, so that's about $80 million. I don't know if that's how the economists would look at it, but it is over what is projected. The excise wholesale tax is about at what was projected, and I think that's significant because there needs to be an understanding that this isn't, we can't count our chickens before the hatch. We do need to give this a few more years, need to let it stabilize. If that excise wholesale tax is bringing in just what it was projected, we need to make sure that we're not doing anything that would make this money vulnerable. And there are many variables that could make it vulnerable.
Such as, people feared the volatility that, we started out really robustly, but what could change? What are the factors that you're talking about?
Some of the factors are the strength of the illegal market. The illegal market still has a stronghold, and we can see the numbers dip significantly when illegal growers in California have a harvest, and it's very likely that they're bringing it here and flooding it into our market. There's unknown variables that could change it because it's such a new program. But if there's a big change in policy, for example, if there's a big upset, or if there's an actor like an unlicensed actor that comes in and is not taxed and then gains a stronghold in the market, for example, could be another one. So it's just really important to protect these funds. We need to make sure that we're turning our attention to make sure that the legal market isn't as successful as they have been. And part of that is making sure there's very clear lines between the legal market and illegal market, and that law enforcement is able to detect when a delivery or a sale is illegal.
Now, Riana, it seems to me that the price is a really important part, and sometimes there's a balance, and sometimes you get past a tipping point, right, with the illegal market. I'm sure the dispensaries have a good sense of what the going rate is and how the taxed rate compares to that. Tell me a little bit about the interaction between those two prices, the street value and the...
Yeah, right now, Nevada's market, the prices are pretty good. You see the tax revenue is good, but there's a fear that it could dip significantly as it's done in other states. We have to make sure that we keep taking care of this program and making sure that these business owners can continue to thrive and keep their prices where they are now, because in other states, the prices have dropped significantly, which of course impacts the tax revenue, which is of course less money going to the state. So we do need to make sure that we're careful with making sure this industry can thrive. Part of that is the significant amount of expenses they pay. They, anywhere from payroll to testing to security to inventory control, the list goes on and on. You see the numbers coming in, but there's currently not being documented those numbers going out. The Nevada Dispensary Association has commissioned an economic impact report, so we will get to see those numbers, but there's a long list of expenses that aren't associated with other industries.
And when I did a story on this, one of the things that was interesting to me is just even the legal costs of trying to understand what's okay to do and how to stay in compliance with the regulations and the state laws and the whatever federal
Exactly. We have quite a few attorneys in the crowd who have quite a few clients. A lot of the establishments have a compliance team. They all have a large amount of staff just working to comply with the rules, comply with security rules, comply with tracking every, you hear seed to sale, that means tracking every seed to the point that it's sold. So just legal compliance exactly is a huge factor. We estimated that there was about $1 million a month being spent. It was $800,000 a month just spent on legal advice. I suspect that it's more than that, and hopefully we'll find out in the economic impact report.
Why did you commission the economic impact report? Was it the members who wanted this, and what exactly did they want to find out through this?
Well, again, we see a lot of tax numbers being reported. We see a lot of revenue, but people don't understand how expensive these operations are. So we wanted to assess really what are those tax numbers and what are the real economic benefits coming out of these establishments, because they are significant. For example, Nevada Independent did an article citing that...
Who did? Oh, okay.
Michelle. Did an article citing that we estimated that real estate investments alone were $300 million since the beginning of the program. That is just one out of this long list of expenses that go into this industry. But real estate investments alone, whether that's buying or leasing or making improvements, we estimated at $300 million. So we want to get an assessment of where is all this money going.
So when you came out of the session, and Michelle alluded to this a little bit, there's a regulatory framework that is set up for all of your members, for all the folks who are in the business. Is the regulatory framework generally considered satisfactory? Is it too loose? Does it need to be tightened up? Is it burdensome? What's the general take from the industry on what they did?
The general take is that there can always be improvements. Hopefully, we can work on there will be improvements made throughout the years, but we are very proud as an industry of this state and what it's accomplished. And we had, strictly regulated industries that came before us that gave us a little bit of insight on how to do it well in Nevada. We had a lot of stakeholders. The governor's task force had law enforcement, had community members, had industry, had the governor's office, had regulators on it. So these were deliberated over for at least a year, the adult use regulations, and so there's a sense of pride because we are doing it really well.
There was obviously a group of people that came up to some of these hearings, especially as the Ledge Commission was about to approve the regulations, and were raising a lot of concerns that these cultivators that just have the cultivation license are maybe at a disadvantage by what the regs say and the process by which the applicants are chosen if there's fewer licenses than there are applicants. Tell me a little bit about why you guys, the ranking process first of all, and it's something you guys supported. Tell me how that's fair to those cultivators that don't have that dispensary license.
Well, we supported the regulations wholesale. There was actually no way to not adopt those regulations that day. If those regulations weren't adopted, we would have an entire adult use market unregulated. So we'd be the first state to have an completely unregulated adult use sales. Because they came forward at the Legislative Commission hearing, they didn't participate in the governor's task force, they didn't raise their concerns in public workshops, there was an extensive written comment period, so it was kind of too late at that point. But we did support the regulations as written. We supported the criteria that Department of Taxation developed for identifying how to allocate the new retail stores that are provided under Question 2. They're not our regulations, but we supported what was written because it seemed, from our point of view, as the best approach to making sure you're getting the most compliant owners. You're getting people who understand the rules, who follow the rules, who are going to pay taxes, and that's really what it's all about. Compliance and paying your taxes, at least, for Nevada's perspective, that's what's most important. And it's especially critical to have the most compliant owners operating the retail stores because it's a federally illegal substance. We have to stay within the rules.
Yeah, and those regs give preference to places that have licenses already or have demonstrated that they could carry it out or have a certain level of capital or donations, that kind of.
Right, and those were question 2 states, it gives question 2 itself, so what the voters passed and what was drafted before the medical industry even existed, states that medical marijuana established owners get this grandfathering period to apply for these licenses. So those rules were passed or were drafted back in 2014 before there was even an industry to speak about. So those were the rules from the beginning. Everybody knew what the rules were when they applied and when they're ranking and when they made their investments in licenses. And I'd say it's worth mentioning that this is the most inclusive application period that has existed in this program because it accounts for diversity. And that, I think, is a lot of people would argue is more important than accounting for whether or not you're independent or not.
I want to wrap up this discussion, Riana, by just, and you alluded to this a little bit, any trade association, whether it's a Nevada Resort Association, Las Vegas Chamber of Commerce, retailers, there's big members and there's small members. And so you're in an almost impossible position all the time. Is there a tug of war that goes on between the larger and smaller members? And what is the makeup of the Dispensary Association? Give people a sense of that.
The Dispensary Association represents represents over 90% of the dispensaries in the South, 85% statewide. Many of the members are vertically integrated, so they also own cultivation and production licenses, which I think has really worked out for the industry as a whole because we keep those cultivation and production issues in mind. They have a seat at the table. We do have some owners with more licenses, some with less. They all work really well together. These are people who were community leaders before marijuana even existed. They're lawyers, doctors, bankers. So they are people who care about Nevada, they care about their community, they care about a strictly regulated industry, and they work really well together.
Really? You tell them the truth? You're here in front of all these people. Everyone gets along together. They sing Kumbaya before every Dispensary Association meeting?
That's been my experience. Our board is pretty evenly split with people with multiple licenses, people with and then people with one license. And I'd say at the end of the day, most of them, of course, this is not, it's not all this peachy, of course, but for the most part, they say we have to do what makes sense for Nevada overall. We can't come in here with this new industry and do things that don't make sense for the industry at large or Nevada at large.
I just want to say before we end this panel, and we're going to take about a 5-minute break, and we'll bring up the next panel and I think Michelle will agree with this. First of all, Riana's been just a huge help in putting together this event, helping us with it. But as I've dealt with a lot of people who are in similar positions, you are always responsive to our needs. You know your industry, you know your members, and you are really a credit to that Dispensary Association. And thanks for doing this.
Thank you. So my board member, I need a raise. Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to take about a 5-minute break, get a drink, and we're going to have the next panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is the most obedient group ever, I think. Have you been smoking something? No, I'm kidding. So I am thrilled, as I said, at the quality of the panelists we've been able to attract for both of these panels. This one we're calling Rules, Regulations, Compliance, and Law Enforcement. And I'll start to my far left, although I don't think that's where he is politically. But Rick Pocker is a former U.S. attorney, and he became the U.S. attorney after working his way up in that office, went into private practice in 1991, and now he's with Boyce, Schiller, Flexner. In the mid-1990s, he was chief counsel to a select House subcommittee looking into national security and foreign policy issues. Please welcome Rick Pocker, everybody.
Thank you.
In the middle there is Melissa Kuipers. She's a former lobbyist and strategist in Colorado. She was in on the ground floor of pot legalization there, which is one of the reasons we love having her here. She also worked with the auto dealers and trial lawyers in Colorado. If it's anything like here, Melissa, you had your work cut out for you. She now chairs the Emerging Regulated Industries practice at Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck. Please welcome Melissa, everybody. And Will Moschella is from the same law firm. He works in D.C. He used to work in the Justice Department, where he was a principal assistant in the Assistant Attorney General. He's testified in Congress many times and once was the Chief Counsel and Parliamentarian for the House Judiciary Committee. He's now a shareholder in the D.C. office of Brownstein Hyde. Please welcome Will to the panel. All right, folks, let's get your take on the question that is on everyone's mind, and you all have a unique insight into this. People want to know what Jeff Sessions is thinking. We all know that he hates pot. He essentially has said, I hate pot. Is he going to crack down on the states that have legalized it? What is the thought process that's going on now in the U.S. Attorney's Office? Let me start with you, Rick. What do you think?
Well, for a little historical perspective here, up until the unlikely election of President Trump, the way the Obama administration had handled the discretion that they gave to U.S. Attorney's Office was through the way of this document called the Kohl Memorandum. And many of you familiar with it because it's scrutinized like it's an ancient text for clues as to how the federal government is going to react. But in the Obama administration, the idea was they knew that they could not change the law with respect to marijuana, that was a congressional exercise that probably was going to go nowhere. So instead, they created a set of guidelines in the Kohl Memorandum that set out these 8 different criteria by which they would evaluate medical marijuana and legal recreational marijuana in the states and make exceptions. The general policy was we're not going to prosecute marijuana. We've got a lot of other things to do. But they carved out 8 different areas where if the activity in the state touched upon those concerns, then the U.S. Attorney would have the discretion to deviate from the normal policy and actually bring prosecutions against those dispensaries or individuals involved in that. Well, needless to say, after the election in 2016, the Kohl Memorandum no longer governs that discretion out in the field offices. I'm a member of the National Association of Former U.S. Attorneys, and every couple of years we have a meeting in Washington, D.C., and we get a special meeting with supposedly the Attorney General. This year we had the Deputy Attorney General because Attorney General Sessions was elsewhere. And somebody raised that with them in our group, and they were decidedly non-committal about what they're going to do with respect to medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, but they made it very clear that the Ogden memo and its successor, the Kohl memo, that's no longer the rule. Now, I think if the individual U.S. attorneys still have discretion, I am sure one of the biggest things on their mind in a jurisdiction like this will be, could you ever really get a conviction with a Nevada jury or a Colorado jury for any crime related to marijuana? And just to be fair to federal prosecutors, it wasn't like, well, I was U.S. attorney back when George H.W. Bush was in office, so that's a long time ago. Attitudes toward marijuana were not as friendly as today, but even given that, we weren't sending FBI agents and DEA agents out on the street to bust people for hand-to-hand sales or whatever. The focus, and I think where this whole war on drugs reached its climax, was in the late 80s, and especially here in Nevada. Prior to that, we didn't see a whole lot of big-time drug dealing. And then Cuban gangs, primarily in cocaine, Mexican gangs with marijuana, and a lot of foreign influences started to bring big-time violence and drug dealing to Nevada. And as a result, the whole country, under the Reagan administration, you had the Justice Department crack down and created what we called the Drug Task Force, which was a specialized unit, dedicated funds and everything else. So we, even here in Nevada, which at that point was a small U.S. Attorney's office, when I first signed up as an assistant, there were 2 Drug Task Force attorneys. By the time I left running the show, there were 7. So I always have to keep in context, it was more the violence and the high level of criminal activity that came with the drugs here that resulted in the investment in the prosecution. And then later, after September 11th, they've got more important things to worry about. So I guess if I had to make a guess now, I suspect that they're certainly not going to, Main Justice is certainly not going to put the chains on any of the U.S. attorneys who want to venture into testing some of these conflicts between state law and federal law. But I think they'll be very careful about the cases they pick. And my guess is that the first salvo will be something like a forfeiture action where you don't have to depend upon a jury and you can depend upon the federal judges following the federal law. I mean, they could shut down legal marijuana simply by forfeiting all the money that the dispensaries are making and just bringing civil and quasi-criminal actions that way. I think if you see something, it's not going to be the headline grabbing, taking down the dispensary on the street for big time drug dealing.
Will, do you agree with that? What do you think? You're in Washington. You've been inside that office. What's the word?
So I think there will be several large takedowns. Washington Post reported last week that supply in California is outstripping demand 5-fold. Where is the excess marijuana going? I think that the Department of Justice is going to be very focused on diversion cases, particularly diversion cases out of California, to the extent that they believe that the regulatory system in a particular state isn't getting the job done. I could see them stepping in. I think, look, a forfeiture case certainly is something that they could do. I don't expect that they will go after an otherwise law-abiding business, but there are significant. Look, the attorneys general of Oklahoma and Nebraska a couple years ago actually sued a particular state, Colorado, because of their concern about diversion. That case went nowhere in the Supreme Court, but the Justice Department is hearing concerns from states that don't have legalized marijuana. So I expect that that could happen if folks are not following their state rules and regulations, and then you could see the kitchen sink thrown at somebody. It could be forfeiture, but it could also be tax evasion, AML charges, money laundering charges, and the like. So I wouldn't want to be that business, particularly that business in California.
But I mean, how closely are they watching these folks who are in business in Nevada for them to kind of piggyback off what you're saying, to slip up, to not follow the regime so they can go after them? Are they watching it closely?
Well, I don't think they have a DEA agent casing every business, but I think they've got, look, post 9/11, federal law enforcement is supposed to understand their domain. And that is true for the FBI, that is true for the DEA. And look, they've got some legal businesses, I think, that are that may be pointing the finger at somebody who's not doing the right thing, right? Because it's a competitive disadvantage. If you're otherwise following the law and the person 2 blocks away isn't, then that may be that's definitely a competitive disadvantage for the legal business. And then this happens in all kinds of industries, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's happening in this one.
Riana just told me they all get along swimmingly. They would never narc on each other. They all love each other, right? Isn't that what I heard? Melissa, let's talk a little bit about Colorado and what was the thought back then in terms of when Colorado started, what the federal government might do, and how did you handle that?
So, when medical first passed in Colorado in 2000, there was no regulatory structure. It passed in the Constitution and everyone basically had possession rights, but there was no regulatory market. Several years later, Obama gets elected and he produces the Kohl Memo, or allows DOJ to produce the Kohl Memo. And it became very clear that the state had to do something. So in 2012, we passed the medical regs. And the idea was if you follow the Kohl Memo, then you'll be okay, right? Under that presidential authority, that would be the right move. So those 8 enforcement priorities were baked into our legislation. And then a few years later, when recreational passed, we did something very similar on the recreational piece and said, look, there's nothing in federal law that we can fix here at the state level, but if we do what we need to do and we pay attention to the Kohl Memo and the FinCEN guidance on the banking piece, then we should be okay. And I think in large part, the state regulatory system still looks that way. We've essentially said, even though Kohl Memo has since been rescinded earlier this year, the fact of the matter is we don't want cartels taking the product. We don't want kids getting it, and continually following that, certainly on anti-trafficking and preventing diversion has been the right thing to do regardless of Kohl. And now we're in a situation, as you've heard, where Kohl's gone, And what does that mean for the long-term stability of the marketplace? And that really is the key question. I will say, from a Jeff Sessions idea perspective, our Senator, Cory Gardner, you may have heard of him, he's done a lot of good things for the marijuana industry and continues to do so, including keeping some very key DOJ nominations from proceeding to the floor as a senatorial discretion. So he's very much working on behalf of, the state law. I think originally he was opposed to it. But the bottom line is recreational and medical are now in the Constitution in Colorado. And a lot of Republicans in particular who say, well, if I support the Constitution on guns, I have to support it on everything else. And that's the position they've taken, which has been a fascinating one, quite frankly. For those of us that have been in politics, me for 20 years, hearing Republicans stand up and support marijuana issues when they probably voted no on both measures has been really a fascinating dynamic, and one that I think you're going to see continually play out as states continue to legalize.
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a 10th Amendment kind of argument for a lot of these Republicans. That's how they justify it. And you mentioned Gardner. Gardner has tried to protect what he sees as Colorado's interests, but he has essentially said that Jeff Sessions has this religious fervor about marijuana. And so, and any of you can jump in on this. Where does that go in terms of how that trickles down to the local U.S. attorney's offices? Does he make a phone call and say, "Okay, it's go time today"? We're going. How does that work? Or does he get a signal from the White House? Trump did not say much negative about marijuana. Quite the contrary during the campaign. So whoever wants to jump in on this, go ahead. Where does that all go? The tension between Sessions and Trump on the issue. What does Sessions do in terms of putting his tentacles out to the local U.S. attorneys?
I'll answer the second part of that. What the current group at the Justice Department would tell you is that they would say, look, we really didn't change much. The Kohl memo said that being in the marijuana business was a violation of the Controlled Substances Act. And, in fact, all four of the memos, the Ogden memos and the rest, all made this statement and then listed kind of the 8 priorities. And so they would say, look, we're just going back to the status quo ante, which vests in each United States attorney. There are 93 of them around the country. You have 1 here for the District of Nevada, 4 in California, 1 in Colorado, then it's up to that U.S. attorney, in the absence of a federal priority, it's up to that U.S. attorney to set priorities for their district. Now, that being said, I think it's interesting. I got an email from a very accomplished libertarian lawyer, and he wrote me asking, look, was rescinding the Kohl memo merely symbolic? And my response was, it's only symbolic if you thought the Kohl memo was symbolic. If the Kohl memo, I think, though, it wasn't. If Kohl memo, I think, became a de facto prosecution policy or non-prosecution policy. But the Kohl memo, as the current group at the Justice Department said, Kohl memo still left every option on the table expressly. And so now the way it works is the U.S. attorneys in each district get to set priorities for that district.
Rick, you wanted to jump in on that?
I would agree with that. I mean, the one thing that was delightful was the amount of prosecutorial discretion you have in that position. And even though you work technically for the Department of Justice, the only one who can fire you is the President of the United States, and he's a little distracted right now. So I think what you'll see, and we had the same thing way back in 1990. You'd get the priority of the week. It would be HUD fraud one week. It would be, some other federal program fraud the next. And as long as you can demonstrate to the Department of Justice that you've dedicated some agents or whatever to the priority of the month, you're fine. And I think in a situation like this, especially in a Republican administration, and this is a broad generalization, but I've seen it to be true for the last 30 years, is Republican administrations give greater discretion to the field. Ed Meese was famous for just, you tell me what resources you need, so that they may have a national focus, but they're going to trust your knowledge of the individual environment in which you're operating to decide what cases you do. In the Democratic administrations, it was much more the policy gets implemented with a greater rigor. So I think here, Will's exactly right. It'll be the U.S. Attorney assessing the situation on the ground and deciding what will fly. And I think even with rescinding the Kohl memo, as you've said, the guidelines are pretty darn good for a state to adopt, in the sense of saying, here's how we're being careful about the impact on kids, minimizing the violence, stopping the diversion to another state. And as a result, those folks will probably be left alone. Nobody wants a fight that they can't win, and unless it's an extreme case of coloring outside the lines, I don't know that most U.S. attorneys in states like ours are going to be enthusiastic about it.
Rick, the difference, let me just ask one follow-up question, Melissa, then I want you to jump in. Rick, but the difference here now in Nevada is people knew something about you, something about the U.S. attorneys who came after you. We know nothing about this new U.S. attorney in Nevada. She was essentially plucked from Texas and brought to Nevada. I think people are like, who is this person? What might she do? She's not tied to anybody in Nevada. She has no reputation in Nevada. Should people be worried, confused? How should they feel about that?
Well, I think it's not the first time that we've had somebody from outside Nevada for a short stint. We had Doug Frazier after Lee Lutfi back in the 90s, and I think that was kind of a cleanup operation. Things were not particularly going well, and somebody from DOJ was sent out. There are some folks who believe that's what's happening here in light of the Clive and Bundy collapse, and it's really just kind of bring in a fresh set of eyes to assess the office. And then I actually heard from somebody in the marijuana business that asked me whether or not I thought this was a signal that they were going to send people from D.C. who would not be afraid to bring these kind of cases. I think that's a little far-fetched. I'm more likely to believe the first scenario, that they just, we've had some leadership problems in that office lately, and I think it's more along those lines. Plus, I think this appointment only lasts 120 days under the statute that she was appointed under, so we may have a Nevadan in there before the end of the summer.
Melissa, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. So a couple thoughts. Jeff Sessions obviously has the ideology that's anti-marijuana. No one has a surprise by that. But then there's a practical reality of what's he going to do about it, right? So two thoughts. There's a resources question and there's a can I win this case question. And just last week in the omnibus that passed in Congress were protections for medical marijuana known as Rohrabacher that essentially say the DOJ can't use resources to enforce against businesses in legal marijuana states for medical. It does not provide those protections for recreational. There was an effort underway that Will and I were involved in to get it there. And the bottom line is it fell apart at the leadership table between Schumer and McConnell. It wasn't a deal that those two were willing to make, at least not yet, and we're going to keep working on that. The second piece of that is, okay, if I do bring this case in a place like Colorado or Nevada or California where there is legal marijuana, can I win it? Can I bring this test case and then have a jury that'll actually convict against a legal marijuana business? And I can tell you there's a significant concern over jury nullification because of that. And nobody wants to go all the way down that road and then lose the case. So those are the practical implications. Could Jeff do it? Attorney General Sessions, sure. Will he? There's a whole road of analysis for him there that I think is not exactly an easy one for him.
And that's why I said I think they're going to start with a significant diversion case, right? I don't think you're going to find too many people who are going to sit on a jury that says that a business who's in a legal jurisdiction should be facilitating the transport of marijuana into a jurisdiction that doesn't provide for that. So my guess is that's not going to be that much of a roll of the dice with regard to a jury.
So you're all pretty convinced they're just not going to bring a case here, fearing that a jury is going to say, listen, they're in business here, they're a legal business, they're not going to do anything, as opposed to people saying, marijuana is a gateway drug. I see it leading to bigger problems. I have a cousin who got hooked on marijuana and then cocaine, and I have a brother. You don't think anything like that is possible? They think they can get it. You're convinced that juries are all pro-pot?
No, look, I don't think that you're going to, even if they thought all the things that you said, you can't prosecute your way out of what these various states have done. That's why I think that it's going to be a case that involves, from one state to, it's marijuana from California going to Texas or going to New Mexico, something like that.
I think another area where it might be fruitful, and I think if I were still in that office and DEA was looking for something to do, I would have them check out the possibility that the people who are running legal marijuana businesses are really running it and they're not just a front. Because I cannot, just based on the way things happened in the late 80s and the power of the Mexican drug cartels, that there isn't some sort of pressure that some of these folks are feeling to just surrender the flow. And if we had a case where you could demonstrate that Mexican drug lords were the real forces behind local allegedly legal businesses, I think that's something that could turn a jury. But you only need 1, 2, 3 jurors to really spoil a case. And I think that's why perhaps, John, you're sensing a sense of skepticism here that we could ever really get that on if we were prosecutors trying to do it.
When I was in the department, the districts on the southern border would not bring a case unless the person trafficking the marijuana had more than 1,000 pounds, right? There's just so much flowing over the southern border. So the Tucson sector, El Paso sector, these were areas where we made the arrest, made the deportation, DEA piled it up in a field and burned it, right? There weren't enough prosecutorial resources for those cases. Similarly, there aren't going to be kinds of prosecutorial resources available to go after a business that's otherwise complying with state laws and regulations. But if that business isn't doing those things, the department could be looking at you.
Are any of our sponsors fronts for the cartels? Could you tell us? No.
Don't raise your hand.
Right. Yeah. Probably a mistake me asking that. Melissa, to talk about your interactions in Colorado, or people you talked to who interacted with the U.S. attorney there when Colorado was nascent and going through all this. What were the interactions like?
You mean under Obama?
Yeah.
So we have a little bit of a unique situation. When John Walsh was the U.S. attorney, it was clear that he would follow the guidance under the Kohl Memorandum, and that was really kind of the end of story. We don't have a new U.S. attorney now under the Trump administration. That person has yet to be appointed. So we have a gentleman named Bob Troyer who worked under John Walsh when he was the U.S. attorney, so it was essentially an Obama administration holdover. So that's a very unique thing for a Trump administration with an AG Sessions dynamic to have an Obama U.S. attorney in Colorado, but that's the situation that we're in. There's potentially going to be some conversations between the U.S. attorneys in legal states about doing task forces and rolling out some communication about what the new policies are going to be in light of what the law at least currently is versus what the motivation about enforcing the law may be in terms of marijuana policy. I think we all agree that it's very likely to remain a Schedule I for quite some time, but how the Schedule I issue is applied to states is really the question, and that is what U.S. attorneys are facing. I know at least in Colorado, U.S. Attorney Troyer is reaching out to local law enforcement to talk about what the enforcement priorities are, because let's face it, when the federal government has a task force, oftentimes they have enforcement participation from local law enforcement officials. And absent that, there's not a whole lot they can do. And that's the conversation that's having, I think, some meaningful dialogue as we speak and will be ongoing. Our interactions are somewhat limited from a lobbying and policy perspective because those lawyers in the Department of Justice tend to be appropriately tight-lipped about what they're thinking. But from what we can gather, it's a partnership approach as opposed to we're coming in to shut you down approach.
Well, you've had a lot of experience with Congress. Is there a potential short or long-term congressional solution that you see coming down the pike?
I think there's going to have to be, right? I think as more states legalize, you're at 30 for medical, 8 for recreational, several more coming either through legislation or on the ballot this year. And sooner or later, like any other issue, that tipping point will be reached where Congress finally has to act. We've all said that we expected banking to be the first thing addressed. Obviously, it hasn't been addressed, and there's a huge public safety argument why it should be. disappointing, quite frankly, that Congress hasn't acted there. But you're going to see some tweaks. 280E was mentioned earlier. 280E is a huge problem. If you want the marijuana industry to pay its taxes, then you should give them the same tax equity that other businesses have. And that's a conversation we've had on Capitol Hill. There's a dialogue about a potential federal excise tax and what that might look like. And that, for all intents and purposes, legalized the industry for a very long time and permanently. Once you're in the federal tax code, you never really quite get out of it. And that's okay for an industry that's seeking long-term stability. So that's another play. So I think the answer to your question is yes. Could we put a timing on it? No. No lobbyist, right, worth their salt will ever tell you what the timing will be. But we can tell you from being in these meetings on Capitol Hill, even the most conservative Republican members of the Senate will look you in the eye and say, I know this is going to be legal, but I'm not in a place yet where I can help you with it. And our response to that is, well, then just stay out of the way while we're working on policy. And they've been okay with that. So interestingly enough, we have many members that say, just don't tell me to speak publicly on it, but if you can do things around us or around me, then that's okay.
So a lot of those senators come from states that haven't legalized yet. And as I look at the landscape, so there's one legislative success this year over the objections of the Justice Department, which was the 2,000 plus page omnibus appropriation bill carries the Rohrabacher amendment again, but there isn't a protection in there for states that have legalized recreational. So these bills that have been introduced fall into a couple different buckets as I see them. One bucket is kind of study bills. Let's study it for veterans' health. Let's study it for health generally. Let's study the issue and postpone the decision-making until some other time. Then there are bills that deal with particular problems that arise because of the conflict between the Controlled Substances Act and state law. So those would be the bills that Melissa mentioned. They address the tax issue. They address the banking issue. And then there are some bills that actually take the problem on directly. And there are a couple different ones worth note, but they're either they reschedule, deschedule, or there is a bill that would say that the Controlled Substances Act doesn't apply in states that have a legal regulatory regime. I personally think that one's got the most political viability. Why? Because that doesn't force a member of Congress from Alabama to vote, make a decision about pot good or bad, right? It's just, I'm gonna defer to these other states. The Controlled Substances Act won't change in my state, and I don't have to make that sort of normative decision, right? We're very hopeful that some of these other problems can get taken care of. Part of the problem is that you can do this on Capitol Hill, right? You go to the Senate Banking Committee, and they'll say, just go down the hall to the Judiciary Committee, and once they take care of your problem, all these banking problems go away. Or you can go to the Tax Rating Committee, and they'll say the same thing. Go down to that other building, go down the hall, and have the Judiciary Committee fix your problem. So I think ultimately that'll happen. And then once it's fixed, then there'll be a host of other issues, because then you're going to have some form of federal regulation, right? So medicine generally is regulated by the FDA in this country, and so you could see medicinal marijuana being regulated at some point by the FDA, and kind of working through a host of issues that raises, but that's kind of down the road a bit.
But that keeps lobbyists in business, so that's good, right?
And lawyers.
And lawyers, exactly.
Well, I'm waiting for that study to come out.
That's right. So, Rick, both of your colleagues here mentioned the banking issue, which is a huge issue, and as Melissa pointed out, it can be seen as a public safety issue at some point, right?
Well, it's one of those aspects of the legal business. This is very similar to the illegal business, and for exactly the reasons they've indicated, is if you're in a cash-only business, a lot of bad things can happen to your cash between when you get it and when you deposit it, or what you do with it when you spend it. So, I mean, that's been one of the challenges, I think, you know, everybody tends to think, well, you'll be prosecuted under Title 21, the federal drug laws. Well, no, there's all kinds of money laundering and violations of banking regulations, and really that would be a good place to start in order to try to normalize the business. And it's an area that if you cure that problem, then you can minimize the potential violence attendant to dispensaries, the kind of robberies, the kind of tax evasion and other crimes, and there wouldn't be a need for prosecution in that area. You mentioned lawyers in this area too, and we've had this come up with the state bar. I'm the president-elect now, and a couple of years ago, there was a concern about, with legalized marijuana here, whether lawyers could actively participate as owners and managers of these businesses. And it was thrown onto the plate of the Board of Governors. We have 15 members, had 16 different opinions about what was ethical and not ethical. And I drew the short straw to explain it to the Supreme Court that we don't have, other than adding a sentence in there that lawyers should proceed with caution because this is still against the federal law, there really isn't any guidance as to whether or not you're committing an ethical violation or you're putting your bar license at risk by so acting. And I think we have a lot of, you know, I don't know all the folks who were given the initial slew of licenses, but there's a number of prominent attorneys in there, and you know, the only guidance the bar and the Supreme Court really gave them was proceed with caution because it is against the federal law. And when we were studying how to handle it, the Gaming Control Board basically said, no, you can't have a gaming license and also be invested in a medical marijuana company as well. And I think some of the other licensing boards made similar decisions. Others went the other way. So that's an area of potential risk for certainly attorneys and maybe other professionals.
I want to talk about the gaming part of it in a second, Rick, but I don't even know. I remember when that happened with the Supreme Court and the State Bar, proceed with caution. What does that even mean?
Well, but we operate by, if I can get 8 votes for a position, that becomes our position. But I think what it means is that, you know, the Board of Governors is multi-generational as well. We've got some youngsters, then we've got older folks like me, and everybody's got a different take on, you know, and we had some folks that said, well, it's perfectly fine if, you know, the citizens of Nevada want to buy, sell, and use marijuana, but a lawyer should hold themselves higher because they have to follow the federal law as well as the state law. And then you'd have others who say, this is Nevada, and the federal government has no business telling us what to do. And John knows, this is what you have in a group of people. And, you know, it was kind of an odd position to have to argue, but it's like, here's where we are, justices. We all sat around the table, and we can't agree on specifically how the bar or the Supreme Court should treat these investments.
Before you jump to gaming, can I say one thing about banking?
Of course, yeah.
So a year or two after the issuance of the Kohl memo, the Department of Justice issued a memorandum with regard to prosecution of financial crimes relating to marijuana. On the same day, and they were coordinated, the FinCEN, which is the center within the Treasury Department that tracks all of the gets currency transaction reports, suspicious transaction reports, does all the anti-money laundering work, issued guidance with regard to how to bank. It basically said marijuana is illegal under federal law, but if you're going to bank it, these are the things that you ought to do to stay compliant. That guidance has not been rescinded. And what I've gathered is that the rescission of the 4 justice memos was not coordinated with Treasury. And I've talked to some folks at FinCEN, and they'll tell you 2 things. We are studying the issue, and we have no immediate plans to make any changes. And the reason is, you know, their mission is to stop money laundering. And to stop money laundering, you want people to be banked, not unbanked, right? You want businesses in the system, not out of the system. This is why in the anti-terrorism area, hawalas are a bad thing. Hawalas are an ancient money-transmitting system used in the Middle East, right? Very hard to track. So they want to be in the system. They want people in the system. They want businesses in the system. They want your banks to make the reports that they're supposed to make under the law. So I think that is going to be because look, if that memo were rescinded, that would be a bombshell, right? Kohl memo and others, we're going to see how that shakes out. That would be a major problem. So I don't expect it right away. Again, they're studying it, and they tell me they have no immediate plans to make any changes in that regard.
What's the translation of that, though, for someone's experiences? We're studying it, we have no immediate plans. Do you go back and say, they have no clue what they're going to do? Is it going to be 5 years, 10 years? I know Melissa says you guys don't like to talk about time frames, but how long are we talking about?
Well, maybe indefinite. It's government, right?
Yeah.
Look, this is one area where they know that if they rescind that guidance, all hell would break loose, right? I would predict that the banks, and Melissa can correct me if I'm wrong, she's closer to it than I am, but the banks in Colorado would get very nervous very quickly if that guidance were rescinded.
So we have essentially one credit union that's banking about $100 million a month in Colorado right now, and that's come online in the last several years. And the fact of the matter is, the federal government is in her operation all the time. They have audits almost every week. They have offices that they come in and they just kind of sit there and look at her books. And the fact of the matter is she's helping them. To the point earlier, if there was ever a case to be brought, that's where all the evidence is. But more importantly, she's taken all that cash off the streets in Colorado, and I think there is a federal law enforcement benefit to that, right? And they've essentially said that. So if that FinCEN guidance were pulled, yes, that would cause all kinds of heartburn throughout Colorado's marketplace. This is the model that Hawaii, I think, is likely to adopt. So the credit union model has been a little bit of an easier sell, so to speak, in terms of getting those owners to engage. In a perfect world, you'd have Wells Fargo and JP Morgan and all these large banks banking the money, and I think the bottom line is they want to, they just can't. And until there's some federal guidance to allow them, and essentially a law change, we're kind of stuck with this in-between credit union model.
What happened in Colorado? I mean, there's gaming in Colorado, too. What happened in Colorado vis-a-vis, Rick alluded to the Gaming Control Board here, which came down with a very stern ruling on this. What happened in Colorado?
Same thing. You're separate, and you cannot commingle. The ownership can't be the same. The licensing structure can't be the same. In Colorado, and I believe here as well, you can't even consume alcohol in a marijuana location and vice versa. So if you have a liquor license, you can't have any marijuana on premise, legal or illegal. The gaming has essentially been the same rollout, and we don't see any change in that. Our Department of Revenue oversees marijuana, alcohol, and gaming and liquor enforcement all together, and they're never going to commingle, at least not anytime soon.
You think that's right, Rick? Here, the history of the gaming industry here is that oh, this is horrible. We can't have anything to do with this until they say, oh, wait a second, we can make some money on this. Maybe we should get involved in this. To me, that would seem the trajectory this goes eventually.
Well, I think it's going to take some time to get there, because the other thing that's firmly rooted in gaming regulation here is almost a piousness about some of these things, because we always have to remain. I mean, if you go way back into the 60s and whatever, when we were the only legalized gaming in the country, it was very important, given the mob influence and outside influences, that we be perceived as cleaner than the hounds.
The gold standard.
The gold standard. And thus, I think you're right, there's a lot of, oh my God, we cannot have people running gaming institutions and being involved in this as well. And
something as clean as gaming mixing with something as dirty as pot.
Right. Yes. The irony of that.
I get it.
But yes, it'll eventually, that outrage will diminish, and suddenly it'll be run-of-the-mill and perfectly okay.
I can make one comment about, look, the gaming industry worked very hard over the years legitimizing itself. There's a casino executive who sits on something called the BSAAG, the Bank Secrecy Act Advisory Group at FinCEN, right? The casinos take a lot of cash. They are heavily regulated by the federal government. They work really hard at AML compliance, but there are always risks, and FinCEN is continuously looking at them. So I think, at least in the short term, they're going to be, very wary of that. And I think the regulators that basically camp out in their back offices are going to be looking over their shoulders.
Can I add some color to that?
Of course.
So our firm represents a fair amount of gaming entities, and one of the questions was, if I have someone comes in who's a big, fancy and very important customer, patron of ours, and they have a duffel bag of cash that smells like marijuana, what do I do with it? And it's a very legitimate question. And our answer has generally been, well, you can take the money, but you more likely than not should file a SAR or do whatever it is that your compliance guidelines would tell you. So we kind of thought that was the easy answer, so to speak. A couple of days later, we get another call that says, hey, we have a duffel bag full of cash now, but it smells like fabric softener. What do I do with that? And this is really, we always say you can't make it up, right? Because, well, if it smells too good, then why was it cleaned, right? And then it kind of goes on. So the gaming institutions, I think you're seeing the practical implication, do I take the money, do I not? Can I allow smoking of all kinds on my gaming premise? The answer is no. I can only allow cigarettes. So it will evolve. I think you will see commingled ownership in time. It's not going to happen anytime soon. It may, quite frankly, happen in Canada a lot quicker than it happens here.
Look, I've heard a couple anecdotes, people going through a McCarran with a lot of cash, and TSA saying, where'd you get the cash? And the response was, I won it at XYZ Casino. TSA calls up XYZ Casino. They said, no, we don't have any record of that.
Shocking. A few more minutes. Let's talk about one other legal issue, and I'm wondering any of you can jump in on this, and that's the issue that's talked about in terms of driving while having smoked marijuana. Much different than alcohol, obviously. The science is not nearly as evolved. I hear Tick Segerblom out there all the time talking about how, it's totally different. You can smoke and you can drive and all that stuff. Where is that all going, do y'all think?
Well, I'll start with that one. So Colorado struggled with it, to be quite frank. There's no breathalyzer for marijuana, and even if there were, it doesn't gauge impairment in the way that alcohol can be determined. There's no .08 standard. A couple years ago, we worked with the governor's office and some municipal and county officials and law enforcement to pass the 5 nanogram inference limit in Colorado, which I can tell you hasn't really been used very much. It's on the books. If you are suspected of driving under the influence and pulled over by law enforcement, it requires a blood test. Most people don't allow a blood test, so they'll object to it. If the blood is drawn, it's then processed and then held till essentially a jury trial. At the very end of it, a jury can infer that you were impaired if your blood alcohol or your blood limit for THC is above 5 nanograms. The real answer is the person or the company that comes up with a roadside sobriety test that actually determines impairment is the next multi-billionaire. It doesn't exist right now. And the other practical problem is a lot of law enforcement paperwork doesn't indicate differences between drugs. It simply says drugs or alcohol. There's not a lot of data. There's not a lot of tracking ability to say, well, it was marijuana versus it was an opioid versus it was something else. There's really no way to know that. So the data's not there. So the short answer is it's really law enforcement discretion. There are some visual tests that law enforcement can do to try and determine impairment, but again, it's really subjective on how they determine what the impairment is caused by.
Rick, you have any thoughts on that?
It's not an area I do much of here anymore, but back in my Army days, I remember, I was a defense counsel representing kids in the infantry division, and, that every other Article 15 non-judicial punishment had something to do with marijuana. And at that time, they thought they had this great test, which we were always able to if we went to court-martial with it, there were always ways to call into question what was going on. And a lot of times, the proof that the command would offer would be something like, well, I smelled it in his clothes, and we saw, green substance under his mattress, and kind of a circumstantial case. So those are a lot harder to make, and I think you're right, whoever comes up with the test is going to be the next hero for.
Let's wrap up this discussion with what I think is a common thread that all of you have touched on, which is, how different, like when you were U.S. Attorney, Rick, how different marijuana is perceived today than it was then. And all of these things essentially are going to take that amorphous time that everyone has talked about, finding a solution to the driving while impaired, getting gaming to be accepted, banking to be accepted, Schedule 1 maybe to be changed in the way that you referred to. It seems like it's not happening fast enough maybe for some of the folks out here, but it's going to happen. It's just that it's that evolution that we just can't see the end point yet, right?
It's going to be like November 1989 when the Berlin Wall suddenly collapsed, because for months, if anybody now, you read a history of that period, you can see all the signals, years before that. It's kind of the same thing here. The idea, more than that now, back in 1990 when, that was my responsibility, the idea that it would ever be legal, just, no. You knew you were always going to have a caseload of 3 or 4 big marijuana importers, and it, the notion was very far-fetched. And I don't know that it happened in any kind of a tipping point yet, but the signs are all out there, and it's perhaps generational. Maybe it's greater awareness. I think the Trojan horse has been medical marijuana, because all of us know somebody who has benefited, that if they had glaucoma or cancer or whatever. And as a result, it softens everybody, even Republicans. It softens your perception of, well, is it really all that bad if it can help people? And that kind of an undercurrent makes a lot of these other notions that 30 years ago would have been completely unforeseeable seem a little more appealing.
Did you know that during Prohibition, Augustus Bush, the CN of the Budweiser company, argued to every legislator that he could get his hand on, and the president, that beer was medicinal and had medicinal properties? I mean, that was part of.
That's been proven, has it not?
I think it has. Look, I know we're wrapping up. I'd give one piece of advice to this group, because a lot of people, are spending quite a lot of time complaining about Jeff Sessions and the current Justice Department. What I would say is get the law changed. Write your letters to your members of Congress, to your senators, get the law changed. I actually think Jeff Sessions is the wrong target. What he would tell you is that he's fulfilling the president's responsibility in Article 1 of the Constitution, that the president's job is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, not to rewrite the law, not to amend the law, not to change the law, but to execute the law. That means enforce the law. So this is an opportunity to go to Capitol Hill and talk to your members of Congress to do what you want them to do, which is change the law.
Melissa, I'll give you the final word. You mentioned earlier 30 states and 8 states. Is it just, you think the tipping point is when we get 40 and 15? When is the tipping point?
I don't know that it's a number, but it certainly matters what the members of Congress, what their makeup is. When there are certain members in power whose states have come online with medical or recreational, you're going to see a lot more deference given to that state law, and therefore a lot more policy outcomes based on that leadership and the power that those leaders hold. I do think it's going to happen in just one day, where all of this pressure has been mounting, the lobbying efforts are underway, the educational campaign, most importantly, has been happening. There are so many misperceptions about legal marijuana that have to be aligned before you can even make the policy argument, and there's a lot of teams, including ours, that are doing that. But I can tell you the perception is changing. There is a lot less anger around the issue. There's a lot more excitement on the medical side of the issue. Quite frankly, there's equal excitement on the recreational side. People come to Colorado and Nevada as well for the tourism component of using a recreational product that's been illegal for so long. So all of that, particularly the economic impact, is mounting. And it's one of those things where one day it'll be the perfect timing to make a deal, and all of a sudden you'll see a headline that there was a deal on marijuana. And I'll tell you, when we were working on the medical regs, this great story. It was every state throughout their session, different interest groups have a lobby day at the Capitol. And this particular day during one of the biggest medical marijuana hearings also happened to be law enforcement day at the Capitol. So you had hundreds of marijuana advocates in a very large, it's called the Supreme Court chambers, the old Supreme Court chambers, filled to the brim at the state Capitol. And then you had uniformed law enforcement officers walking around as well. And it also happened to be an emphasis on Canine Appreciation Day. So we're all standing in the lobby and the elevator's open and all these German Shepherds come out and they're pointing and barking and they're running to the committee hearing, right? and they have found the holy grail of marijuana. Like, this is their big day. Like, I did it. And the law enforcement officers run after them, they catch them, they regain control of them. And we were all kind of standing around watching this unfold, and the cops look up at us and they said, you know, they just don't understand what elections are. And we all had a really good laugh. And I think that is kind of the point, that this is changing and there will be change at the federal level at some point.
Melissa, Will, Rick, thanks so much for coming. Let's give this great panel a round of applause. We're going to take another 5-minute break and we'll be back. I'm going to start while everybody's getting back, so we don't keep everybody here all night. This is our third and final panel that we're calling Trends and Troubles in a Fast-Growing Industry. And I want to introduce our panel. I'll start again at the end with Neal Tomlinson. He's the managing partner of Hyperion Advisors, one of our sponsors tonight. Thanks for that, Neal. We appreciate that. His practice includes administrative law and government relations, and he's practiced in state and federal courts, including arguing before the U.S. Supreme Court. Let's welcome Neal Tomlinson up to the stage. Next, Neal's Amanda Connor. She's a principal in Connor & Connor, and her practice is focused on cannabis and business law. She represents key players in the industry in the regulatory and compliance processes. Please welcome Amanda. Last but not least, John Ritter. John's a legend in Nevada real estate circles, using BLM auction process to acquire parcels, then develop them. He's a well-known local philanthropist. He's also on the board of the Nevada Dispensary Association. Please welcome John Ritter. All right, let's just have a general conversation about the industry, folks, to start it off. John, let me start with you. After this career in real estate and doing this, you get into this industry. You understand business as well as anybody I know. What surprised you the most about this industry?
Everything. It's, it's not a get-rich-quick scheme at all. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of capital. I think everybody in the industry has said that it cost them a lot more to get up and running than they thought.
Why is that?
Well, for most of us, I think we were building a plane as we were flying it. And the industry is so new that there just aren't a lot of people that have been in the industry on a commercial scale for more than a few years. So the expertise just doesn't exist.
And so, how did you deal with these surprises? All of them?
Just keep trudging along. Just keep working. I didn't expect it to be this much work and this much time and effort, but we just kept going. I think all of us in the industry were losing our asses when it was just medical. We were writing big checks every month, and frankly, I don't think that we'd really have a hell of a lot of industry left if recreational hadn't been approved. So it's just a matter of keeping your head down and working hard. And the other thing that's new for me is just the regulatory scheme. I've never been in a business that has that strict of a regulatory structure. And you were talking earlier about the gold standard in terms of gaming. We know how to regulate things in this state, and so Nevada, as to marijuana, is really considered to be the gold standard because it has incredibly tight regulations.
Is that what your clients tell you, Amanda? I mean, and when you represent people, is it that the regulations are very tight? Is it that, I thought I knew everything, and then there's a surprise that came up on Tuesday that I didn't know about Monday? And as you as a lawyer, is that how you've experienced this as well?
I do agree that Nevada's regulations are the gold standard here. We tightly regulate marijuana, and the regulators did a great job of looking at the other states that had regulations and learning from those and adapting them to Nevada. But it's constantly changing. I love it because in my job it's something new. I feel like every day. But we are, the industry has been in existence since 2014, and I think we're on our 6th set of regulations, including temporary and emergency and other types of things. So in addition to regulations, we have policies. So yeah, my clients call me and say, I thought I was doing it right, and often my answer was, well, on Monday you were, but now on Wednesday, it's something different.
Is it because the regulations have changed, or are there, it seems to me that that's part of it, but it's also, are there things about the industry that are specific to this industry that you didn't see coming and you said, oh, well, we can adjust? How has that worked for you?
I think it's partly the regulations are changing. Also, the local governments are adopting their ordinances as we are learning. Nevada's, for instance, one great example is our testing regulations. We thought we had some great testing regulations under the medical program, and we learned very quickly as the industry got up and running that changes needed to be made. And so at the state level, they started working through that, and we're still adapting and changing those.
They're not uniform, those local government regulations, are they?
They are not uniform. Just in the valley, right? We're looking basically at 4 different local governments, and depending on where you are, there's different rules. There's literally 2 dispensaries across the street from each other, one in the city, one in the county, and they can do different things because of where they're located.
Neal, do you experience that the same way? Is it a constant surprise? You don't know what you're going to wake up to in the morning?
It's definitely a challenge, John. I've been a regulatory attorney for 20 years in Nevada. I started out at the Public Utilities Commission, and the marijuana industry has been the biggest challenge of my career. I can tell you that. I know when I was asked by some clients to look at the legislation that was proposed back in 2013 so that they could decide whether they wanted to get into the business, I really didn't know much about cannabis at all, but I dove in and I learned about it and helped shepherd some of the legislation through. And I remember at the time I had people say, well, Neal, aren't you afraid that getting into the cannabis industry as a lawyer is going to hurt your reputation? And my response was, well, I'm a regulatory attorney. This is going to be the most tightly regulated industry on the planet. I would be more concerned if I didn't get into it. And so that's how I got into it. I got into it because I had clients who decided to get into the industry, but they wanted to make sure that they did it right, and they wanted to make sure that they were compliant. And so they asked me to help them with that. And I've been very fortunate to have that opportunity. And it like John says, it's required so much more work and so much more compliance than I think people initially thought. So that's been probably one of the greatest challenges of this new industry for us.
Neal, do lawyers look at this differently than, for instance, the folks who are in business? In other words, you like all the regulations because you can navigate your way through whatever the system is, but your clients say, oh my God, you guys call it the gold standard, I call it oppressive.
Absolutely. There's a tug of war between the business side of it and the legal side of it, but they have to coexist, because if we are not tightly regulated, like your panel said before, the federal government may come in and they may do something. And so I always tell my clients, look, I know it can be frustrating. I know it takes a lot of time and money. I know you have to create new compliance positions in your organization, but you need to do it because you need to continue, even though it's been rescinded, you need to continue to follow the principles from the Kohl Memo. You need to continue to follow all the state laws and regulations. And by doing that, you're going to give yourself the best chance of success and the best chance of not being intruded upon by the federal government.
You worry about that, John, after that discussion we just had? Was that reassuring to you, that first panel, or did it scare you even more?
When the session thing first came down, it was pretty tense. Since then I'm involved with a couple different organizations, one that's working on the 280E taxes, one that's working on banking, a banking fix. And so I think that panel I thought was pretty dead to rights. And it makes me feel like the safest place to be is a state that's heavily regulated, and in a company, involved with a company that is very good at following regulations. And as a business owner, in terms of the regulations and the question that you asked, Neal, is for us, we look at the regulations as an opportunity, because if we can run a tight ship and follow the regulations, it's a benefit to us. It's a barrier to entry, because a lot of companies just can't do that. And so we look at it as an opportunity. And before I forget, I just wanted to to say that I wanted to thank you for putting this on, and I wanted to thank you for putting the Nevada Independent together, because with what's happening in our state right now, we really need an independent newspaper. And so,
thanks for that. Thanks for coming tonight. I think we'll close on that. We appreciate that. Everyone should become a member, right, John?
That's right.
Thanks for that. No, I do appreciate it, and we want to put on more events like this, just for that reason. I'm sure you get this too, Amanda. You know what people in business want, what I've heard throughout my entire career covering politics, businesses don't want politicians in their pocket necessarily, or they don't want to give a ton of donations and then think that they can get they want predictability, they want stability. And that's got to be so frustrating for you as an advocate, for a lot of your clients, because there is a lot of volatility out there surrounding this industry, right?
There is. I think that's one of the things you have to embrace if you're going to be an owner or involved in the marijuana industry, is that you've got to embrace that it's not a stable market or industry. I think that's one of the greatest, perhaps, payoffs is you are the business owners in Nevada are well-established, respected business owners, but they're willing to take a risk. They're willing to put in that extra work and effort and time, and they wrote big checks for several months, years to get to where they are, and they still know that it's a long road to go down until hopefully there's a big payoff at the end.
And so you represent big and small clients, right? I mean, some are bigger than others. Are their interests different when they're going before a regulatory body?
So I represent single-owned cultivations all the way through, vertically integrated, multiple license facilities. I don't lobby, to be clear. So
is that a dirty word?
No, I'm not a rep. No, it's not. I think for what I do, it would be really hard to lobby because I do have clients that have varied interests. But for the most part, on a lot of our regulations, all of my clients can come to some sort of agreement. One thing is they want to be regulated because they don't want the federal government coming in. Another thing is, I don't represent labs, which is one area I've decided to stay out of, because in Nevada, our labs are independent, and often their interests are adverse to the cultivators, producers.
Explain that so people understand why.
Why? In Nevada, we have a very strict testing regulation, and the labs are all for-profit businesses. So obviously for their interests, it's better to have more testing mandated, testing that requires, is they can charge more for, and often, obviously, the cultivators and producers don't want cost prohibitive testing. So often that has been one of our biggest challenges in regulations, is finding the balance there. And the regulator's perspective, and I think everybody comes at it as we want testing to make sure that we have safe products on our shelves. But what is safe and what needs to be tested to ensure it's safe can be debated all day.
Neal, you mentioned you've been doing this kind of thing for a long time, a few decades. What are some of the issues you could deal with the PUC? That's very complicated stuff that you dealt with when you dealt with them. What is different? What are the different challenges with marijuana businesses than exist with other businesses, besides the obvious ones that we've been discussing tonight?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious one, the federal component to this is the big one, obviously. With most privileged licenses, the number of licenses is kind of a different situation here. So we have, as you know, by law, there's only a certain number of dispensaries, licenses that are allowed. And it's by county, and that was initially set by legislation, but then when retail marijuana came, the number was set by question 2, which was approved by the voters. So that's kind of a unique situation too, because you have a limited number of licenses that are potentially available out there, and so that kind of makes a unique environment from a business competitive standpoint. You've got different interests that see the potential of those different licenses in different ways. So I'd say those are kind of some of the differences. I did lobby last session. I've lobbied for probably about 15 years. Last session, I did represent the Nevada Dispensary Association, and I can tell you it was a very challenging session. The tax component of that was a big part of it, obviously. We had packaging and labeling bills. We had a lot of just different moving parts up there. Of course, we had the governor's 10% tax that needed to be implemented as well. There was also a component of it that allowed some of the incorporated cities out in the rural counties to apply for and have a dispensary license there when their counties opted out initially from the medical program. We see those coming online now in the city of West Wendover. I had a client that was successful in getting a dispensary there, and also in the city of Fernley is getting a dispensary. So those are some of the challenges. We also, I think, a big challenge that all of us had is, including the state regulators, is we had a shift in regulation of regulators. The medical program was regulated by the Division of Health. When Question 2 passed, the language of that ballot initiative called for the Department of Taxation to be the regulator. As an industry, we sort of felt that it would be very problematic to have two different regulators. And so we were able to navigate some legislation that included language that shifted the duties and responsibilities from the division to the Department of Health, to the Department of Taxation. So we've had a transition of the primary regulator as well, and I think that was also a challenge, but the department stepped up and did a fantastic job implementing Question 2 and really kind of taking on that transition head on, and I think it's been a good thing, and they've done just a fantastic job, but it certainly has been a challenge.
So you're saying you did a good lobbying job the last session in getting that done?
It was a collective effort by a lot of people, and a lot of them are in this room.
Very well done. So what about the whole issue of taxation? Any of you can jump in on this. I think if you look at this from the outside and you see the excise tax that was put out on top of all the other taxes, wow, this is a lot of taxes, isn't it, John?
Yeah, it's a lot of taxes.
Did you think it was going to be that many taxes when you got into the business?
No, I mean, the 10% came out of the blue. Yeah. I mean, I guess I looked at that a little bit differently than some people did, because I thought of it as, if the state's got this 10% tax and it's important to the state coffers, isn't that kind of a good thing for us? Because it means the state's going to want to support our industry and preserve and protect our industry. So that was the way I looked at it. You know, I will say that we're at or maybe over the threshold of taxes that doesn't push business into the black market. You know, our biggest competitors as an industry are not other licensees, it's the black market. So, you know, the rule of thumb is that, you know, all in taxes, including every single thing, you know, you got to be under 20%. I mean, under 30%. We're now a little bit over 30%.
Right.
Some states have had to drop their taxes. You know, I'd love to see over time, maybe as the industry gets bigger and it matures, that we can back off on those taxes a little bit. Because, you know, really, again, in my mind, the way I look at this industry, and when I talk to politicians and they say, I don't want marijuana in my city or my county or my state, you know, my answer to that is, that's not the decision before you. The decision before you is whether or not you want marijuana sold legally, taxed, regulated, tested. You know, we have 160 employees, give or take, and our starting wage is $13 an hour. Within 6 months, most people are up to 14 or 15. You know, we've got middle-level managers making 6 figures. We have health insurance. I mean, it's a real business. And so don't you want to take that money out of the hands of the drug cartels, put them into real businesses with real employees? So, you know, we have to do what we need to as a state to make sure that we're paying our fair share, but also that the industry is sustainable.
Your clients, either of you, jump in, either one of you, do they fret about the black market, the illegal market a lot?
I think that's one of their primary concerns. It's their major competitor, and I think, you know, having an unregulated market and product available to them puts their business at risk.
And so what do they suggest should be done about it? What do they tell you is a solution to that?
Delivery system. We need an efficient system to deliver product quickly and conveniently and seamlessly to people who are legally able to purchase it. That's really what needs to happen.
So they can't get it just easier on the black market is what you're saying?
If they can get it easier on the illegal market, they will. And that's what I'm saying. I think that if we as an industry come up and with the regulators and the local governments come up with a system that works for a legal delivery, that's where you're going to start to make inroads to eliminating the illegal market. But until that happens, it's going to continue to be a challenge.
It would seem to me, maybe you can jump in on this, Amanda. It would seem to me that if you're going to say you have this tightly regulated marketplace, what Neal just suggested happening is more difficult to do, isn't it?
Much more difficult. I think, you know, you want to, Riana touched on this in the very beginning, we need to make sure that law enforcement can clearly identify what's legal product versus what's black market so that they can start shutting down the black market industry. But as soon as you take it out of a storefront and put it on the streets, you know, traveling to a consumer's residence or hotel or wherever they may be, it makes it a lot more difficult to do that. The Department of Tax and their new regulations that were just recently passed did address delivery, and delivery is permitted, but there are quite a few restrictions in there, and the idea was to make it easier for law enforcement to identify what is a legal delivery from a licensed facility versus something on the black market.
How so? How do they distinguish?
Well, there are certain things. First, any delivery vehicle has to be inspected by the department and will be given a little card, and that list, my understanding, is going to be provided to law enforcement. So they'll know if it's a vehicle that's a part of a licensed facility. There's manifests that track. The state in Nevada, our state has a real-time inventory system that reports to the Department of Tax every seed, clone, plant, and harvested product. And it will tell them when it's out on delivery. So the Department of Tax and law enforcement can work together to verify that. They have manifests in the car to go along with it. And then they restricted where deliveries can happen. Part of our keeping gaming and marijuana separate, no deliveries to any gaming licensed facilities. And then they restricted it to residences.
Neal, does that create a problem for anybody getting into the business who's not a John Ritter?
You mean the delivery component of this?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I mean, I agree with everything Amanda says. It does create new challenges, but you know, we've had meetings. You know, I was one of the founders of the Dispensary Association and served as its first president. And even back then, we immediately reached out to law enforcement, trying to develop a good relationship. And I think we've done a good job of that. And John's continued that. And Metro is in favor of making the delivery system more efficient, because they are also of the opinion that if people can get a product that they want in a quick and efficient manner, they will do so even if it potentially is illegal. And so we have to just take the convenience part out of the equation, so that, because I think that if people are offered the choice of getting something that's tested and regulated, I think they're willing to pay taxes and do all that as long as they can still get it in a convenient fashion. So it's certainly going to be a challenging task to solve, but it can be. And I think you know, efforts have been happening with that. They need to continue to happen, and I think that they will. It's just going to take time. I mean, it's a new industry. We don't want to run before we walk. So I think the regulations that just passed, I think they're good. It's a great step forward, and it's going to take some time, but eventually we'll get the delivery system figured out, and it will be able to be monitored by law enforcement and be able to help us reduce and hopefully and someday eliminate the illegal market.
How much of this, Neal, just has to do with people getting more educated about what the situation actually is. There seem to be so many misconceptions still about what's going on, hopefully some of which we're fixing tonight for the people who are here, and we'll see this later.
John, I think education is a big issue. I think that the industry has done a lot, but I think the industry together, we need to do more. I think education and consumer awareness are some problems that we have. I think a lot of people, even to this day, they don't know, whether it's legal for them. They know that, marijuana is legal in some fashion, but a lot of people just don't know. They don't know the ins and outs. They don't know the FAQ, the frequently asked questions. We need to get that information out. I can tell you that I know that there's a group that just started up called the Responsible Consumer Alliance that is a nonprofit that is out there. I know that they're meeting with hotel industries, rental cars, all businesses in all sectors in Las Vegas, trying to get a program in place where it's a collective effort to try to educate not only our locals here and employees here throughout all industries, but also tourists about what is legal and what's not, just so the people know, because I think that's a big challenge for our industry right now, for people knowing personally what they can and cannot do.
Somebody a long time ago did some focus group where they figured out that if you have your first name of your group responsible, people are going to take you seriously, right? I've noticed that so many times. John, you think there are a lot of misconceptions still out there about the industry?
Yeah, I mean, we have, one of our locations is very much tourist oriented. It's right on Swenson, about a quarter mile north of Tropicana. So a lot of the traffic from the airport goes by there. And we get tourists there every day still that walk in and say, you mean I can buy marijuana here legally? And when we rolled out, we weren't the first state. There was a lot of confusion about how it was rolling out, when it was rolling out. It wasn't like Colorado, which was international press, and everybody knew as of a certain date you could go there and buy legally. In Nevada, we had a lot of legal wrangling. The distributors, there was a lot of articles about the whole distributor issue. There was the Early Start program, which the governor put into place, and I have to commend him. He wasn't supportive of recreational marijuana, but when the voters approved it, he said, okay, let's get it done as soon as possible.
And tax the hell out of it.
And tax the hell out of it, yeah, right.
Yeah.
And to that previous conversation, I think it's a damn shame that 10% at the end of the session, to get the deal done, had to go to the rainy day fund instead of education. That was his whole point, and that we as an industry generally embrace that idea. It's one of the things we really need to fund better in the state. But yeah, I think there's a lot of people that still, just like Neal said, there's a lot of people that don't understand that you can buy it. I was in a competitor's dispensary a few weeks ago, just kind of checking it out, and there was this woman there that obviously was, in her late teens, early 20s, in the 60s. And she was just standing next to us in line, just going, can you believe this? I can actually walk into a store and buy marijuana. This is unbelievable. So, I think I'd love to see a lot more education in general.
Who does that? I mean, does the Dispensary Association take that on? Who does it?
We are, actually. The Dispensary Association is doing a lot of education. And we advocated through the permanent regulation process, we advocated very strong to add educational components to it. They've done a great job of that in Colorado, where they've earmarked a certain amount of the funds that are coming in for education. I think we need to do that here in our state, maybe in the next session.
I think
Can
go
I
ahead,
jump in?
please.
I think the one education piece that we haven't touched on that is so critical here is educating our children. So I have 2 children. My son, who's 11, was recently at school, and the counselor came in to give the drug talk. And the first thing the counselor said to these kids in the public school was, I want to talk to you about a drug. It's federally illegal. And of course, we're young kids. They don't know the difference there. But and it's a very important thing that you understand that it's something you need to just say no to. I'm talking to you about marijuana. And my son immediately, in front of the whole auditorium, raised his hand and says, my mom helps people get marijuana every day. And I went, oh my goodness, you did it. And and then he said, and I continued, Mom, and I said, and it's very important because there's sick people like my grandma who needs this marijuana. And I started choking up, but I thought, our kids,
This is definitely a pro-pot crowd. I'm shocked.
Our kids need to struggle with that. Okay, if it's legal, if I see it on the billboards driving down the street, if I can, if people are talking about it, what does that mean? They know, my son can tell you alcohol's bad. I can't have alcohol till I'm older. But what does it mean for marijuana? And Colorado, again, who rolled out their program, I was a former kindergarten teacher. So I met with educators in Colorado. They developed an amazing program for their schools to teach kids what does it mean. And Nevada really needs to invest in that here for our children.
I agree.
Well, what about the interaction or tension between the medical marijuana market and the recreational marijuana market? There are some people who think the medical marijuana market's not going to survive this transition. What are your takes on that?
Can I comment on that?
Go ahead.
So there's a big misconception about what a medical patient is and what a recreational customer is. There are lots of recreational customers that are using marijuana for medical reasons, but they don't want to go get a card, put their name in. There's, ex-military, ex-law enforcement, and other gun enthusiasts that have concealed weapons permits. To get that permit, you'd have to lie on the application if you have a medical card. So they don't do that. There's lots of people that are just, rightly so, paranoid to have their name on a list showing that they consume marijuana. So I think the elected officials like to believe that there's this bright line between a medical patient and a recreational customer, and I think the line is very blurry.
So should it be blurry? What do you do about that?
Well, I don't know about should it be blurry, but I will say that most of my clients are very strongly in support of the medical program. And one very important reason is because at the federal level, as discussed in the previous panel, there's some protections in the omnibus bill for medical programs and not recreational. And at least in Nevada right now, every recreational store or cultivation production is co-located with a medical. So it's combined business. I think that's an important thing. I think the business owners are very strongly in support of keeping our medical program alive here to help the patients and also to help their business.
Because it's protection.
It is some form of protection, yeah.
You agree, Neal?
I do, and I have the same experience. The clients that I have are highly supportive of medical. They want to preserve it. I know part of our agenda at the last session for the Nevada Dispensary Association was to do everything we could to improve and preserve the medical program. And we did that. There were some changes that were made to the card system that were good changes. Certainly more can be done and hopefully will be done. But I believe in the medical program. I got involved when it was a medical program, as did everybody else. And I think for the majority of everyone wants to see the medical side of this succeed. I also have clients who give priority, and I think probably most dispensaries do give priority to medical patients. So they have a I don't know, fast pass line or whatever you want to call it, but there's an expedited system to make sure that their needs are addressed immediately and quicker through the process, so that they don't have to wait. So I think that's very important. I also think that the medical program is extremely important because that's the only way we're ever going to have any real medical studies and medical research in this state, which I think Nevada should be the leader with that as well. And the only way we're ever going to have any of that is to maintain a solid medical program. And so I hope that everybody and all the owners and people involved in the industry will continue that fight to preserve and make the medical program viable for everybody.
Now, isn't the smartest way to handle that to partner with the universities, and get the universities to put their imprimatur on the research, as opposed to, I mean, no one, I mean, being cynical, not that I can relate to that, as John knows, but you know, a study put out by the Dispensary Association is not as credible as something put out by UNLV or UNR. I mean, has there been thought to doing that?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that, you know, it's baby steps. You know, I think that's going to happen. I know that there have been some, you know, a lot of the initial owners in the industry are medical doctors or other doctors, DOs, MDs, and I know that they got in this industry for medical purposes. So there are some studies that are going on right now. I know there's an independent lab that's done a study over some terpene profiles over 2,200 different marijuana samplings. So it's happening. It's going to happen more. And I think eventually that you're going to see some partnerships with some credible research institutions that will give the imprimatur that is necessary to make sure that we have, you know, some credible study and research that can be published and get out there.
You think so, John? Think it's going to happen?
Well, maybe over time. I think it's a great idea. I think that the universities, in my experience, are concerned about losing potential students. You know, if parents hear that the university's doing a pot study, that they may not want their kid going to school there. I think there may be some federal funding issues also with the universities, but I definitely think it needs to be done. Research needs to be done.
Again, this gets back to, and I thought I heard you chuckling about this. When I talk about this, these universities have places that study gaming. They're named after gaming people, as if there is some kind of different standard or stigma applied to pot than to gaming. I mean, there are probably more people addicted to gaming than there are addicted to marijuana, right?
So this is a ridiculous conversation that
excuse me,
that happens on an ongoing basis, right? Because you've got and you know, God love them, they built this city, but you got these gaming icons, right? That well, until recently, everybody looks up to, you know, as you know, with great respect and admiration. And you know, I think about it, and I think, geez, you go back not too far in history, gaming was illegal, alcohol was illegal, and some of our main industries in our state are these giant places where you go to get drunk and gamble, right? And those are respectable, you know, business people, right? It's the same with marijuana. I mean, we're respectable business people, we're highly regulated, and yet people look down on us, and it's just time, you know, another 5, 10, 20 years, and it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be regarded the same way gaming is now, and you know, their whole industry. Is
there something different about it, either Amanda or Neal, both? Because it's, as opposed to gaming, which is kind of in an intangible way, a drug, but pot is a real drug. Is it different? Is it going to take longer than John's saying, or do you think it's going to be time, but maybe it's not 5, 10 years, maybe it's 25 years? How long is it going to take?
Go ahead.
I'm going to not guess on the amount of time, but I agree that it takes time. I don't think it's different. I think it's just people being educated. I think for so long with the war on drugs, people and reefer madness, people were educated about how marijuana is terrible, how there's no positive benefits. You know, my husband in our law firm has this poster up that talks about if you give the woman reefer, you know, she's going to do all these heinous sexual acts. It's just really, so many people grew up being taught that we've got to change the public perception.
But isn't it more than that, Neal, in the sense that, if I recall correctly, law enforcement came out, or at least some people in law enforcement came out against Question 2 on the premise that a lot of people believe, not just law enforcement, marijuana is a gateway drug. It's not just you can smoke pot and it's relatively harmless. It's going to lead to other things. Does the science eventually catch up with it, or maybe it is a gateway drug?
I think the science already disproves that. I'm not a scientist, but I mean, I read a lot. I think that, you know, that That's been an argument that was created for a political purpose, and it was a successful political purpose. So it's going to take time for that to change as well.
There's still fairly powerful groups, even on a national level, that still argue that to try to stop marijuana legalization across the country. You know that.
Absolutely, and I think that that's exactly why that we only allow people 21 and older to make the decision whether or not to consume the product. And so that's how we safeguard from that. I do just want to say on the gaming thing, I mean, I understand, you know, and I don't disagree with everything that John and Amanda said. However, I do think that the separation that we have in the state was necessary. It was a necessary step, and it will take time to you know, eliminate that divide. But I understand the reasons for it, and I think it was a necessary interim step at this point in time.
You're talking about the Gaming Control Board banning the gaming folks from being involved? Well, you don't think that'll last forever?
I hope it doesn't last forever. I'm not going to guess on the time either, but you know, once things change at the federal level, whenever that is, I think then we'll start seeing that go away as well.
You think so, John? You talk to your friends in the gaming industry and say, what are you doing? You're behind the times?
I talk to my friends in the gaming industry, and they say, this is ridiculous. Our hallways of our casinos smell like pot, and no one's supposed to be smoking it. So it's pretty hypocritical, but I understand. I agree with Neal that the gaming system has been so well run and so highly regulated for so long that I agree. You got to be really careful of a new, you know, kind of regulated industry, a controlled substance, particularly one that isn't legal at the federal level. You know, I will say, doing a lot of work in Washington for many years, amazingly enough, even among Republicans, the stance towards marijuana seems to change as the polls change. I know that might be shocking.
Right. Terribly shocking.
And you know, the polls, it's like gay marriage. It's like a lot of other social issues that have fallen much faster. I'm not saying it's going to fall much faster. You know, that depends on a lot of different factors, but you can see the poll numbers changing so rapidly now, and particularly changing as more and more jurisdictions adopt medical marijuana or medical and recreational marijuana, and they find out that it's not, you know, the world's not going to end, the streets aren't going to catch on fire, and, you know, it's reasonable business, and it's not going to change things. And again, this idea that because it's legal, more people are going to use it, I'm not sure that's borne out. And I think that stigmatizing a substance has never, ever proven successful in keeping it away from the youth. In fact, it makes it much more attractive, in my opinion.
Well, let's wrap up this discussion. Let me have both of these lawyers weigh in here on this question. Beyond the obvious threat of some kind of federal intervention that we've already talked about, I'll start with you, Amanda. What do you see as the biggest threat, regulatorily, legally, for your clients that they're going to have to confront in the near future?
That's a great question. The biggest legal threat
or regulatory. I mean, for instance, there's the haphazard ways that local governments have approached this. That's got to be frustrating to your clients. There must be holes that you're finding maybe in the state regulatory apparatus. What worries you about going forward needs to be fixed?
I think that, you know, like we've discussed, they just rolled out new regulations. I think the implementation of those is probably our biggest next hurdle to come over. We went from a little less than 100 pages of regulations on to now almost 300 pages, and it essentially went into effect overnight, with the understanding that certain things like shelf life testing or updating your security cameras or those kind of things couldn't be done instantaneously. So the rollout of seeing how that's implemented, and this will be really the first time, although the program's been with the Department of Tax since July of last year, this will really be the first time seeing the Department of Tax really implement its own regulations and carry them out in the facilities regarding their operations. And they created like levels and fines and all different things. So it will be interesting to see that roll out. That's our next big hurdle.
With a brand new tax director too.
With a brand new tax director who wasn't involved in marijuana policy or regulation beforehand.
Right. Neal, what's your answer to that question?
Well, I agree that the new regulations are, first and foremost in front of us right now, but I also think that the ongoing banking situation is one of the biggest issues that we have. The Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering rules, those are all daily challenges for cash-run businesses like we have here. I mean, it's a safety issue. All these businesses are conducting business with cash. I got called into my professional banker's office asking why I'm depositing cash. It's an issue. It's a safety issue. It's a convenience issue. It's a business issue, and it needs to be addressed. And so I would say with the new regulations and the ongoing banking and financial transactions, those are probably the two greatest issues that my clients bring to me on a regular basis.
Another great substantive discussion. I really appreciate all three of you coming, John, Amanda, and Neal. Thanks for coming tonight. And I want to thank everybody here for coming to our first Indy Forums. Thanks for coming.